Let's watch this one next. This is the fact and fiction, both Viking siege of Paris, 1845, and no, not 18, 845 and 885, 40 years apart, by SandRhoman history. I really like the TV show Vikings. I know it's not accurate, but I really like it. And there's a really great part of it, which is maybe the first siege of Paris. Really trying to make crossing and border awful. People wait a day or more sometime. That's crazy, yeah. So yeah, I know a little bit from Vikings, which, you know, means I don't know much, I assume.
Paris was attacked by Vikings at least 5 times. Nowhere are their attacks depicted as vividly as in the TV series Vikings. Ragnar and his warriors charged the walls from land and sea.
Don't break my immersion, don't tell me it was all fake. I love it. I love it so much. I love that show.
They built floating siege towers to scale the walls from the river and face sophisticated traps set by the defenders, such as massive ballistae, cauldrons of hot oil, and a wheel of death. Paris resists these assaults until Ragnar fakes his death and leaps from his coffin at the funeral in the cathedral to kill the bishop.
I don't care, it makes any sense, I love it. I love it.
Take Gisla, the emperor's daughter, hostage. Vikings tells a thrilling story, but it is a story that never happened. In this video, our goal is not to ask how historically accurate the series is. After all, it is a television show designed to entertain, and a certain amount of artistic license is justified. Instead, we will ask which historical events inspired this part of the show. The Vikings stood at the gates of Paris many times. Ragnar, or rather the Viking leader Raginarius, was the first to reach the city, while Rollo was one of the leaders of the last Viking siege of Paris. It was this final assault that inspired many of the epic elements in the series. So let's take a look at what the Vikings were actually up to in the Frankish Empire, and how they came to advance to Paris, into the heart of the empire, and what role the historical Ragnar and Rollo played in these events.
The traitor Rodolf.
Alright, no sponsor. We're trying to become more independent. The short story is that it's a hassle to find brands that we're actually willing to work with. However, we still have to pay the bills. What we ideally want to do is finance our videos by offering the best service or products available that we think are relevant to our audience, and thereby making supporting us as easy as possible.
That's much better than most channels.
4 changes so far, but there's more to come. Firstly, we changed our merch store to Fourth Wall, which is a creator-owned platform that provides the best quality for prints. You can now buy a large portion of our artwork there. Check out this print that I ordered as a sample. You can even see the original watercolor effect on the top. Very cool. If you buy one of these paintings via our store, a share of the money goes to the artist that we work with. Secondly, we started to put together a list of books that are worth reading, which have nothing to do with the topic of the video. We will expand this list as time goes on. You can find the links in the pinned comment and description. Thirdly, we updated our Patreon page, and in the coming weeks we are going to focus more on content, including polls and updates on our life outside YouTube, including the course we teach at the University of Zurich. Lastly, we enabled supers here on YouTube, for people who prefer not to donate via PayPal. If you decide to support us, have our most cordial thanks. We are very fortunate that we are able to produce videos as our job, and we know it wouldn't be possible without the support of our audience. So, thank you.
It's an obscure feature.
When a storm hit the west coast of the Frankish Empire in 799, the monks of the abbeys of Noirmoutier looked out to the sea in fear. What frightened them was not the weather, but the sight of a fleet of Norsemen. These Norsemen were the first to attack the Frankish kingdom. The monks got off lightly in this case, because the storm was allegedly so strong that the Vikings were unable to land on the island. However, they were soon followed by other Norsemen who came to the Frankish kingdom seeking wealth and fame. Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, built defenses along the coast and the large rivers, but while fortresses, coast guards and ships prevented the worst, the Vikings still managed to spread fear and terror.
You can't stop the
They relied on surprise attacks on defenseless targets, such as villages, monasteries or trading centers, which they plundered, disappearing before the defenders could react. The Frankish Empire was not the Vikings' only target. Beginning in the late 8th century, The Scandinavian warriors staged raids all over Europe, even reaching as far as the Mediterranean. According to the historian Jim Bradbury, England, Scotland, Ireland, and the Frankish Empire were most affected in the 9th century.
Yeah, I did play Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which I also think is probably not the most accurate, but even though it's not that great of a game, it is a beautiful looking game, and being a Viking raiding the countryside of England was kind of fun, even though it wasn't that great.
The brutal attacks by the fearsome warriors were so influential that the period between the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793, which is considered the first Viking attack in England, and the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 is referred to as the Viking Age. In the 830s, Viking attacks on the Frankish Empire increased dramatically. The empire was weakened because Charlemagne's son and heir, Louis the Pious, was at odds with his sons. The Vikings took advantage of this and raided farther inland. In addition to hundreds of small monasteries and villages, the Norsemen now attacked larger targets like Dorestad, one of the most important trading centers in the empire. Though they escaped the first attack, the monks of Noirmoutier had not seen the last of the Vikings. Their fate shows how formative the Viking raids were for the inhabitants of the coastal region of the empire. Noirmoutier had been a regular target of the Vikings since 814. To protect themselves, the monks built another monastery farther inland in 819, where they could take refuge during the Viking raids in the summer. When the raids did not stop, they finally abandoned their island monastery and relocated. Their island became a base for the Vikings, who began attacking the Loire region almost yearly. After Louis the Pious died in 840, the civil war resumed. His sons, Charles the Bald,
there's some guy called Pepin the Hunchback,
Louis the German, and Lothair the First fought over their father's inheritance for more than 3 years. Once again, the Vikings took advantage. Before the quarreling brothers could agree on the division of the inheritance in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the Vikings attacked Rouen, the trading center of Contonville, and the city of Nantes, among other places. The raid on Nantes exemplifies the Vikings' methods. In June, they rowed up the river Loire with 67 ships and attacked the city when the inhabitants were celebrating St. John's Day. The surprise attack was swift, decisive, and brutal. They plundered the city in a single day and then retreated to Noirmoutier with fully loaded ships, where they settled, quote, as if they meant to stay forever, end quote, as two chroniclers reported. They did not stay forever, but they remained over winter, which was longer than usual. At this time, warfare was seasonal, which means it was customary for an army to return home in the fall. Their new ability to stay put made the Vikings even more dangerous, and they became a real threat to the Frankish Empire.
Ragnar, the siege of Paris.
The river Seine, with its green, wooded valley, was one of the lifelines of West Francia. It supplied the region with water and was an important transportation route. In 845, however, no trade goods came along this route. Instead, it was traveled by the fleet of the Viking leader Raginarius, or Reginarius, as he is referred in the annals of Xanten. Reginarius is often identified with the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok.
So they're not the same person?
Some even believe that Ragnar and his raid on Paris form the historical core of this legend. However, there is scant reliable evidence that Ragnar existed.
Vikings was a very mixed show in quality, but Travis Fimmel as Ragnar was like the best thing about it. Just an incredible actor. So good.
And many historians consider him a mere legendary figure. The attack on Paris by the historical Reginarius has little in common with the siege in Vikings. In 845, Reginarius moved up the Seine unusually early as March. As a result, he caught Charles the Bald, king of West Francia, on the wrong foot. The king was not prepared for an attack and needed time to raise an army.
Look bold.
This gave Reginarius and his men time to plunder Rouen and push toward Paris. When Charles's quickly assembled troops tried to stop them at Saint-Denis, a battle ensued. In Vikings, the subsequent fight is not taken up at the siege of Paris itself, but earlier in the 3rd season.
That's right.
Ragnar's Vikings fight as mercenaries of Quenrith of Mercia and defeat the armies of their uncle and brother in the same way Reginarius defeated the Franks. Charles the Bold deployed his soldiers on both
Yeah, they were
banks of
stuck
the
on both
Seine,
sides like
so the
idiots.
Vikings could not simply pass by. This was a strategic mistake. When the Vikings landed on the side of the smaller Frankish division and attacked it, the rest of Charles's army had no way of crossing the river, and had to watch helplessly as Reginarius's men massacred their outnumbered comrades. Allegedly, they took 111 prisoners and hanged them on an island in the river. This crushed the morale of the second part of Charles's army, which fled almost immediately when the Vikings changed banks. Very little is known about the subsequent attack on Paris itself.
Okay.
Reginarius and his men reached the city on Holy Saturday, the 28th of March, 845. Because many inhabitants had fled, they were able to enter the city and plunder it without much resistance. When they returned, Charles, who had received further reinforcements, was still camped at Saint-Denis. It would have been easy.
So I guess Paris at the time was really just like an island. It hadn't really expanded beyond the water yet.
Easy for him to cut off the Vikings, but he had bigger problems. He was still at odds with his brothers, but there were regional uprisings against him, and he was under immense political pressure. Therefore, he decided to make a deal, paying Reginarius the immense sum of 7,000 pounds of silver to stop plundering and withdraw. Charles was often criticized for this decision, but such tributes were actually quite common, and were used by other rulers, including Alfred the Great, to deter the Vikings from plundering.
Makes sense.
These payments later became known as Danegeld. As far as we know, Reginarius never returned to Paris, but his men plundered several monasteries on their way home. Peace did not last, however. Over the next few decades, the Vikings increasingly poured into the Frankish kingdom, using the major river systems as transportation routes to advance far inland. Charles the Bold did his best to stop them, but his quarrels with his brothers and various uprisings took up so much of his time that he could only devote himself entirely to this task in the 860s. At that point, he finally repaired the crumbling defenses, supplemented them where necessary, and allowed groups of Vikings to settle in the coastal regions in exchange for defending the land against other Vikings. This tried and tested strategy worked well in other parts of the empire, such as at the Rhine-Meuse-Scheldt delta, which is now part of the Netherlands. Charles paid particular attention to the Seine region. It was the economic heart of West Francia and one of 4 regions the Vikings particularly liked to attack. As the rivers were the Vikings' main traffic routes, Charles built fortified bridges to prevent the Norsemen from advancing further inland. The most important bridge at Pont de l'Arche was constructed in 861 to 866. Charles was the first Frankish ruler to use bridges as river barriers, possibly the first ever. This military innovation probably also inspired the chain Rollo uses to block the Seine in the 4th season of Vikings. Unlike in the series, however, according to the historian Carol Gilmar, the actual river barrier at Pont de l'Arche was a low-lying fortified wooden bridge. It stretched between 2 stone towers protected by an additional wall, which were garrisoned by at least 100 men each.
Would it be easy to destroy then if it's just a bridge?
Thanks to these measures, Charles succeeded in securing the Seine region. Until his death in 877, there were significantly fewer attacks on the area. However, this did not last long. When Charles' son, Louis the Stammerer, died just 18 months after him, West Francia was divided between his son and the rebel Bozo of Como.
Charles the Fat.
Louis' sons were also not destined for long lives, and in 884 only the 5-year-old Charles the Simple was left as heir to the throne.
Wow, the name's so bad, I mean. You'd think like they're kings, they're rulers, they would like to have some cool names. Is it just like the name that the people give them, basically?
This chain of short-lived rulers destabilized the empire. As Charles was clearly unable to rule, the nobility decided to hand over the reign to Emperor Charles III, known as Charles the Fat, although he was not actually fat. Charles III unified the Frankish Empire for a short time, which gave the Franks hope that he would finally stop the Viking incursions. Alas, those hopes were in vain. Charles was...
Like, how do we know that? In the history did they record? And thus, Charles the Fat did this, in parentheses, but he wasn't fat.
Was not a good general. He often avoided confrontations and preferred to pay Danegeld instead. This easy money contributed to a new wave of Viking attacks on Francia from the 880s onwards. Charles did his best, but he couldn't stop them. The rivers of his realm became veritable highways for Viking fleets, and almost all important cities were plundered. This culminated in the arrival of a large fleet at the mouth of the Seine in 885.
Again, it's crazy when you think about it. I mean, this seems like such an easier way to do war, you know? Like, you know, they're always coming up the river. Like, if they were coming on land, it's much more hard to stop them, but they're always coming up the couple rivers that there is. Like, is it really that hard to stop them?
It was on its way to the heartland of the Frankish Empire. But first, they had to pass Paris.
Rodolphe, the traitor.
The Ile de la Cité is only a small part of Paris today. In the 9th century, however, the entire city lay on the island. Fortified with old but solid walls, it was home to around 5,000 people. Although Paris was not yet the capital of Francia, the siege in 885 and 886 demonstrated its political and strategic importance. Paris was the gateway to West Francia, both figuratively and literally. The city was connected to the mainland by 2 bridges, the stone Grand Pont on the right and the wooden Petit Pont on the left.
Big and small bridge is what it means.
Paris formed a formidable barrier and could easily deny passage to enemy ships. This is precisely what Odo, the Count of Paris, would do in 885. Odo's portrayal in Vikings has little to do with the historical figure, apart from the fact that he defended the city together with Jocelyn, the Bishop of Paris, who is considered the first fighting bishop in medieval literature. A Viking by the name of Siegfried led the attacking army. At his side were Cynric, who in Vikings is a wanderer who shows Ragnar the way to the Seine, and Rollo. Medieval sources characterize the historical Rollo as a true giant. He took over high command from Siegfried during the siege, and, as in Vikings, remained in the Frankish kingdom afterward, but more on that later. The eyewitness Ebbo Kernus, the most important and detailed source on the siege, reported that Siegfried and Rollo led around 700 ships and between 30,000 and 40,000 men
for the time.
Insane. Most modern historians consider this a gross exaggeration
and
estimate the army size at around 200 ships and 5,000 to 8,000 men, which is still a sizable force. Ebbo was probably not entirely honest about the defenders either. He reported that Odo...
It's always like that. I mean, for example, like when you think of Thermopylae, you know, of the 300 Spartans defending against like the mass army of Persia, right? And I think in the history it's recorded that Persia had like 3 million men or something, but it was more like a couple 100,000, which is still crazy, right? And same thing that there wasn't actually 300. It was 300 Spartans, but they had a bunch of like other warriors with them. Some from Athens, some from Sparta who weren't Spartan themselves, right? So it was a couple thousand, not just 300. It's always like that. I understand like wanting to like exaggerate to make it even cooler, but I feel like the history is already cool enough already. I don't know.
Odo had only 200 knights and their retinue at his disposal. According to the historian Hans Henning Quatum, aside from these exaggerations and embellishments, Ebbo's reports are pretty close to the actual events. When the Vikings were sighted at the mouth of the Seine in July 885, Odo immediately began to prepare the city for the attack. He repaired the walls, built towers at the outer ends of the 2 bridges, and rounded up as many men as possible.
Like again, I keep thinking about it, but they know every time that they're coming from the river, like every single time. You know, it doesn't have to be the chain from the show, but there must be many ways to like stop them, right? Like you can have archer with fire arrows shooting at their boat as they're coming up. You can build more like bridge and defenses on the river. Like, I don't know. It doesn't seem that hard. You know exactly where they're coming. Exactly.
In the meantime, the Vikings plundered Rouen and then moved farther upstream. They soon encountered the fortified bridge at Pont de l'Arche, which, unlike in Vikings, they did not bypass by carrying their boats over land past the barrier. They simply destroyed it. However, some of the Vikings may have marched from Rouen to Paris on foot via an old Roman road. This would explain why they destroyed a second fortified bridge over the Oise, a tributary of the Seine, which is not actually on the way to Paris. On the 24th of November, the army finally reached Paris, and Siegfried informed the defenders that he was not after the city, but rather rich Burgundy. He offered to spare the town if they let him pass, but Bishop Jocelyn and Odo refused.
I mean, they can literally just pass and then when they come back, destroy the city or pillage the city.
The siege began the next day. the Vikings attacked the tower on the right bank of the Seine, which is not yet complete. They tried to storm it by attacking simultaneously from their ships and land, but the defenders, led by Odo and Jocelyn himself, repulsed the first onslaught. The following night, they continued to work diligently on their tower and even built a second wooden floor on top. When the Vikings returned the next day, another bloody fight ensued. While arrows, stones and other things rained down on them, the Vikings tried to undermine the tower and bombarded it with heavy equipment, including catapults and ballistae. At the last minute, the defenders prevented the Vikings from compromising the tower by pouring a mix of boiling wax and pitch over the men digging at the foot of the wall. However, they probably did not use such enormous quantities in huge cauldrons as in the series. We explained why this was unlikely in our video about the 5 biggest myths about medieval sieges.
Okay.
The defenders had heavy equipment as well. As in Vikings, Ebbo reported that one of their ballistae impaled 7 Vikings like a human kebab, whereupon a defender with a particularly black sense of humor demanded that this human skewer be taken to the kitchen immediately.
Good one.
On the 3rd day, the Vikings reached one of the tower's walls. The Franks put up a desperate resistance, and when a militia of citizens rushed across the bridge, the attackers were driven back. After this setback, the Vikings withdrew. They built a fortified camp on the right bank of the Seine near the church of SandRhoman-l'Auxerrois. From there, they plundered the hinterland of Paris over the next 2 months and built more siege engines. Although these were not floating siege towers like Floki made in the series, they were almost as impressive. Ebbo reported that the giant machines ran on 16 wheels, were partly
they actually look way more impressive, yeah?
equipped with battering rams and had huge ladders. By the end of January, the towers were ready, and the Vikings attacked again. Although they also harassed the town, fired a hail of projectiles directly at it, and even reached a wall at one point, their focus was once again on the tower on the right bank of the Seine. While 2 groups tried to get to the bridge from their ships, a third renewed the land-borne attack. This time, they protected themselves from the defenders' projectiles on the upper floor by forming a testudo or tortoise formation, and a protective roof, which may have looked similar to the one in Vikings. In addition, they tried to fill the shallows beside the tower to create a dam and get directly to the bridge. At this point, the Vikings brought one of the siege towers forward to protect their workers. When this plan failed, they resorted to even more drastic measures. They floated 3 burning ships down the river to set fire to the bridge. Much to the relief of the defenders, however, the vessels sank before the bridge suffered.
That's what I keep being surprised, like so much of what they talk about is made of wood, and yet there isn't much talk of just burning it.
For too much damage. Above all, Paris was an obstacle for the Vikings on their way upriver. This became apparent when a heavy storm on the 6th of February caused a smaller wooden bridge on the left bank of the Seine to collapse. The Vikings immediately attacked the isolated tower and forced a few defenders to yield by placing a burning wagon at the wall of the building. The 12 men who finally surrendered were all executed.
Damn.
The Vikings had thus secured control of the entire left bank of the Seine, not only near Paris but also far upriver and downriver. Instead of intensifying the attack on Paris, they plundered.
Obviously, I was gonna say like the other thing, like, was there no army to go help Paris? Like, it seems like, you know, obviously Francia was a big place, right? So it seems like the siege took a long time. Was there like no army from anyone else coming to like help from the outside?
Other areas along the Seine and swarmed southwest, advancing as far as Chartres, Le Mans, and Évreux. The siege of Paris appeared to have become a secondary concern. Meanwhile, in the city, desperation grew. The defense had been quite successful, but fear, hunger, and disease were taking their toll on the people. Odo and Jocelyn had proven their worth as leaders. Their men fought bravely and courageously, and even managed to destroy 2 siege towers during sorties. In this way, they also repeatedly brought supplies into the city. Nevertheless, Odo knew they needed outside help if they were to survive the battle. The long-awaited support arrived in March.
That answers my question.
Margrave of the Franks, the leading military commander of Charles V, approached with an army from the east. He delivered supplies to the city and robbed the Vikings of some provisions and horses, but couldn't push them back. At the end of April, he had to leave without having accomplished much. The Vikings had entrenched themselves well and were numerous enough to stand up to the relief army. After Henry left, the Vikings moved their camp to the left bank, near the abbey SandRhoman to put the Seine between themselves and any further troops from the east. Morale in the Viking camp sank with every failed attack. It hit rock bottom in April. Siegfried, who had lost the confidence of the men,
I was gonna say at that point, is it really worth it? Like, for them it's not about conquering land, it's about getting loot. So, like at this point it can't be worth it anymore, yeah?
negotiated a tribute of 60 pounds of silver and left. Rollo then took over supreme command. He maintained the siege, which was not difficult, as the Parisians were no longer fighting only hunger and fatigue. A plague was spreading through the city, killing hundreds, including Bishop Jocelyn. The people were desperate, and Odo knew he had to act. Because of this, the Count of Paris secretly sneaked out of the city in early July. He rallied some reinforcements and let Charles, who was on his way home from Italy through Burgundy, know that Paris urgently needed help.
This.
When Odo returned with fresh troops, the Vikings intercepted them near Montmartre, forcing them to engage in a bloody fight as they tried to re-enter the city. The Vikings subsequently launched another major attack, but failed once more. In August, news finally arrived that Charles the Fat was marching from Metz to Paris. Margrave Henry, who had joined the emperor in the meantime, hurried ahead with a small force. But once again, nothing went according to plan.
Request on chat
when Henry wanted to inspect the Vikings' position,
so this might be the last one I do for today,
to tempt him to attack. Henry fell for the ruse, charged, fell into a pit, and was killed by the Norsemen.
Damn.
About a month later, Charles the Fat finally arrived and made camp near Montmartre, forcing the Vikings to retreat to the south bank. The following events are very obscure. Ebbo, who was very critical of the king, reported that he drew up his army in front of the Viking camp, but then opened negotiations instead of attacking. Be that as it may, Charles paid the Vikings a large tribute and allowed them to do precisely what the defenders of Paris had tried so desperately to prevent: pass through and plunder Burgundy.
Well,
this may have been the act of a statesman, but it made Charles look like a coward, especially in the eyes of those who had risked their lives to defend Paris. He lost the trust of his subjects entirely and was deposed soon after. The Frankish kingdom was divided once again, and Count Odo, the hero of Paris, became Odo of France, the king of West Francia. He had proven himself a match for the most significant threat of the 9th century, the Vikings. After Odo's coronation, Paris never again saw an invading Viking army.
I do wonder, like, in the show, Odo is not very likable, right? Like, he's a warrior, but, you know, there's a weird storyline where he's, like, basically really into, like, whipping girls, I guess. So, like, he takes them into his dungeon and he just whips them. And he likes that, I guess. Is that accurate in any way?
And what about Rollo? After the siege, he moved farther inland with his men and plundered the upper Seine region, until a group of local nobles defeated him at Chartres in 991. King Charles the Simple, no more simple-minded than his predecessor had been fat, then struck a deal with Rollo. In return for the county of Rouen, he was to defend the northern coast of West Francia. Their treaty was the origin of Normandy. As in Vikings, Rollo thus actually became an ally of the Franks and, as Count of Rouen, even part of their nobility. Until his death in 927, Rollo consolidated his rule, and his county became home to both Norsemen and people from Francia. Under Rollo's son and grandson, the settlers developed their own culture, which was neither exclusively Nordic or Frankish. 2 generations later, the inhabitants of Normandy, the land of the Norsemen, were no longer Vikings or Franks, but Normans. About 100 years later, William the Conqueror...
Probably not, because I wasn't actually born here. I live in Normandy, but I was born in Marseille, and then I lived in the south.
Would lead them to invade England and decisively change the history of Europe.
Okay, well, great video. Great video. I mean, super interesting. What I can say, super interesting. I still love Vikings, but I never thought it was super accurate. But I do love historical setting show, whether they're accurate or not. So it's good to learn the actual story. I feel like it's just, you know, a good way to look at this kind of shows and movies is to make you interested in learning the real story, right? I think that's what it is. So yeah, great video. I did learn an actual lot I didn't know. But yes, sorry guys, I would love to check out more videos, but I really have to leave it at that for today.